The restaurant was bustling, the clatter of cutlery and low hum of conversation filling the air, but I could feel every eye at my table skipping over me. It had become a pattern over the years, no one truly noticing, no one really valuing what I brought to the table, literally and figuratively. My family had perfected the art of dismissing me, the quiet one, the one they assumed would always accept their slight nods and backhanded compliments. I sipped my water, pretending not to notice the whispered snickers exchanged between my siblings, the way they leaned in toward each other like they were plotting some inside joke I would never understand. Then my daughter, sitting across from me with that mischievous gleam in her eyes, leaned close and whispered, "While I distract him?" Her tone was playful, but my chest tightened instantly. I knew that look all too well. It was the same one she gave when she was about to shake up a classroom, sneak in a prank, or defy someone who underestimated her. And just like that, my curiosity spiked. I glanced at the table, seeing the same smug expressions I'd grown used to, the subtle jabs disguised as casual remarks about my career, my choices, even my outfit. They didn't know I noticed, but I did. I had spent years building, earning, and quietly shaping a life they assumed would never rival theirs. I let them think they were the rulers here, the clever ones, the ones who mattered. It had been easy for them, underestimating me, laughing at me. And yet, sitting there, listening to my daughter's whisper, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Anticipation. Not fear, not anxiety, but the quiet thrill of a plan beginning to unfold. They thought this lunch was just another occasion to brush me off, to make me feel small, to laugh at my expense without consequence. They had no idea what was about to happen, no inkling that their carefully constructed world included me far more than they ever imagined. The laughter around the table rose, and I smiled faintly, raising my glass in a toast I knew would carry more weight than anyone suspected. My daughter's grin met mine across the table, unspoken understanding flashing between us. While they plotted their usual distractions, underestimated my presence, I was already calculating, observing, and preparing. Today might look ordinary, mundane even, but it was the first step in a story they would never forget. I sat back in my chair, pretending to laugh at one of my sister's stories, but my mind was elsewhere. Every word, every laugh, every sideways glance at me was a reminder of years spent being overlooked. I remembered birthdays where gifts were chosen for my siblings while I got something last minute, a polite nod, or worse, nothing at all. I remembered family dinners where my opinions were interrupted, ignored, or dismissed with a sigh, as if my thoughts were inconsequential. And still, I smiled, nodded, and played the role they expected, because no one saw the value behind the quiet exterior. I thought about the time I had taken a chance on a family project, only for my ideas to be credited to someone else, my input minimized, my effort forgotten, or when I had sacrificed weekends and holidays to help, yet been accused of overreacting when I asked for acknowledgement. They didn't see me. They couldn't see me, and perhaps that had been my advantage all along. Even now, at this seemingly simple birthday lunch, I sensed it. Their assumptions, their blind confidence that I was harmless, irrelevant, beneath notice. They had built their world thinking I was small, predictable, and easy to dismiss. But what they didn't realize was how much I had quietly accumulated over the years. Knowledge, influence, resources, patience. Every slight, every slighted birthday, every ignored conversation had been quietly filing into something bigger, something they could never predict. I felt a small, almost imperceptible thrill, thinking about the contrast between their perception of me and my reality. They saw a woman who accepted her place, who tolerated insults, who smiled through ridicule. What they didn't know was that I had been calculating, watching, and learning, gathering strength quietly, almost invisibly. And now, at this lunch, when my daughter whispered that mischievous plan, I realized how deliciously ironic it would be for them to finally see the truth. Their ignorance had become my ally, my secret weapon. They believed they knew me, yet they didn't know the half of it. And that, I thought, as I sipped my wine and met their glances without flinching, would be their undoing. They were about to learn just how underestimated I had been, and how carefully underestimated people often wield the sharpest power. As the appetizers arrived, the table felt smaller than it actually was, suffocating in the warmth of forced smiles and hidden barbs. My sister, the self-proclaimed queen of wit, leaned over to my brother with a conspiratorial smirk and whispered something just loud enough for me to hear. It was a joke at my expense, clever only to them, and I let a tight smile mask the sting. My husband, seated next to me, caught my eye briefly but offered nothing, no comfort, no intervention, because he had long learned that my family's dynamics were mine to navigate alone. The waiter set down my plate, and my cousin, who had a talent for subtle cruelty, leaned forward and murmured, "Oh, I didn't know they served that here. Must be a special occasion." The emphasis on that felt deliberate, a tiny dagger aimed at my taste, my choices, my presence. Across the table, my niece, oblivious to the tension, fidgeted with her napkin, while my parents exchanged smiles with my siblings, ignoring me entirely, as though my existence was an afterthought. Even the seating arrangement was telling. My chair slightly pushed back, tucked out of the prime positions, a subtle cue of their hierarchy. They praised my brother's recent promotion endlessly, offering compliments that sounded rehearsed, each word underscoring my own stagnation in their eyes. My sister recounted a recent social event, exaggerating her success and charm, while I nodded quietly, the familiar mix of pride for them and bitterness for myself bubbling underneath. My achievements had always been met with polite nods or passing acknowledgement, while theirs were celebrated, dissected, and gossiped about as if they defined the standard we all were supposed to measure up to. I felt the familiar ache of invisibility, the tiny humiliation stacked like bricks around me. Every dismissive glance, every whispered aside, every preferential comment aimed at someone else was a reminder that in their minds, I was less than invisible, replaceable. And yet, as I watched them revel in their own self-importance, I felt something else. Clarity. I could see the patterns, the weaknesses, the arrogance, and the blind spots that had shielded my quiet strength for so long. Even my daughter's whispered plans seemed almost prophetic now, a beacon cutting through the weight of their condescension. They had no idea that every slight they dealt, every favoritism displayed, was building toward a reckoning. The lunch, seemingly mundane, was an arena, and I was already calculating my moves, silently acknowledging every insult, and storing it for the moment it would have its due. They were blind to me now, yes, but I was wide awake, observing, remembering, preparing. I took a slow sip of my water, letting their chatter fade into background noise as my mind drifted to what they never acknowledged. They saw me as quiet, inconsequential, the one who tagged along to family gatherings with polite smiles and unassuming clothing. What they didn't see were the years I had spent building my career from scratch, navigating a male-dominated industry with determination they assumed I lacked. Promotions that came slowly to them seemed effortless to me. Victories that felt monumental to me were dismissed as luck or timing in their eyes. They assumed my life was ordinary, unremarkable, even fragile. But the truth was entirely different. I remembered the moment I signed the deal that finally made me a partner in my firm. The countless nights spent working while my family laughed at my boring dedication. The apartment I had bought, the investments I quietly managed, even the people who respected and sought me out professionally. They were invisible to my family. To them, my success was theoretical, abstract, unworthy of the same pride they so openly displayed for each other. I had built influence quietly, power that operated in the background, subtle yet unshakable. Their laughter at lunch suddenly felt thin and hollow, a stark contrast to the reality I carried within me. They believed I was powerless, harmless, and easily brushed aside. But I knew the truth. Every contract I signed, every board meeting I dominated, every person I mentored or guided had strengthened my foothold in a world they didn't even know I commanded. The disparity between their perception and my reality was deliciously wide, a canyon I could use to my advantage when the moment came. Even my daughter, sitting across the table, seemed to sense it, her small hand brushing mine as though to whisper, "They have no idea." My life was rich not just with money, but with independence, strategic advantage, and the quiet knowledge that I had never needed their approval to thrive. And yet, they continued their subtle jabs and snickers, oblivious to the power I wielded just beneath the surface. The irony was intoxicating. They had dismissed me for years, not realizing that the quietest person in the room was often the most dangerous when underestimated. Her whisper had been innocent enough on the surface, almost playful, but the way my daughter's eyes sparkled made me sit up straighter. "While I distract him," she had said, a mischievous lilt in her voice. And for the first time, I realized this lunch wasn't just another passive gathering. It was the perfect opening. I had always known she was clever, but today she was my partner in subtle revolution. That tiny phrase had ignited a plan that had been quietly forming in my mind for months, fueled by years of being overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. As the courses arrived, I began to orchestrate small maneuvers, subtle cues meant to test their reactions. A compliment from me was timed to elicit either surprise or irritation, an offhand remark designed to unsettle without revealing intent. My sister, ever vigilant for any perceived slight, raised an eyebrow when I casually referenced a recent business achievement they had never acknowledged. My brother's smirk faltered, a small crack in the armor of arrogance he wore so easily. Each reaction was fuel, a confirmation that I could pull at the threads of their composure without revealing the web I had spun. Even so, not everything went smoothly. A misstep here, a glance misunderstood there, reminded me that precision was essential. The waiter nearly interrupted my carefully timed observation, a misplaced dish causing a ripple of awkwardness I hadn't planned. My husband, unaware of the brewing storm, made a joke that fell flat, threatening to draw attention to me in a way I didn't intend. I forced a smile, keeping my thoughts guarded, feeling the pulse of tension rise with each small, unintended disruption. Yet with every minor misfire, the thrill deepened. I realized that these small cracks, these imperfections, were part of the dance, teasing the family into overconfidence, making them believe the usual hierarchy remained intact. Little did they know, my daughter and I were reading them like an open book, cataloging their arrogance, their blind spots, their predictable reactions. The stage was set, and the first moves had been made. By the time dessert arrived, I felt a quiet satisfaction. My whispers to her, my calculated remarks, the tiny provocations, they all hinted at the storm beneath the surface. They thought this lunch was ordinary, a celebration of me in name only. But for the first time in years, I felt like the conductor of a symphony they could neither hear nor anticipate, and it began with a single, simple whisper. As the conversation meandered toward weekend plans and holiday updates, my family continued their familiar dance of condescension. My brother bragged about a new investment, his voice rich with self-satisfaction, while my sister chimed in with an exaggerated laugh at a joke clearly aimed to diminish me. Even my parents joined in, subtly highlighting achievements of my relatives while glossing over anything I had done. I smiled politely, nodding as if I hadn't noticed, even as a familiar sting of dismissal curled in my chest. They assumed I was unaware, naive, and powerless, a blank slate upon which they could project superiority. But I was far from ignorant. Every reference they made to investments, successes, and social maneuvers, I had already analyzed and anticipated. The gap between their assumptions and my actual knowledge had never been wider. I knew their financial decisions, their public image struggles, and their weaknesses better than they realized. And yet, they continued, blinded by arrogance, openly flaunting their perceived dominance. Each careless word, each subtle insult, was fuel for the plan slowly building in my mind. My daughter, sitting across from me with a quiet smirk, took the first initiative. While my sister's attention wandered toward another topic, she subtly nudged the conversation in a direction that exposed my brother's exaggerations, revealing gaps in his carefully constructed persona. It was small, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but I caught it immediately and felt a surge of pride. This wasn't just a lunch. It was the beginning of a collaborative strategy, a partnership that my family could not detect yet. Even as they laughed and dismissed her comment as childlike curiosity, I could see the impact. Their overconfidence made them predictable, and her subtle intervention created opportunities I could exploit later. The energy around the table shifted, imperceptibly to anyone else, but entirely perceptible to me. They were underestimating both of us, thinking they were still in control, and that assumption would be their undoing. By the time the plates were cleared, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The table, filled with mockery and superiority, was now also a stage where my daughter and I were testing the waters, setting traps without them realizing it. They didn't know how far we could see, how much we understood, or how completely underestimated we truly were. And that, I knew, was the secret advantage we had. Their ignorance was our weapon. I excused myself to the powder room, more to buy time than to check my lipstick. The mirror gave me a private stage where I could breathe and let the plan take shape without the chorus of their voices pulling at my attention. In those quiet seconds, I mapped out what would become the strategy, not a rash revenge, but a sequence of small, precise moves designed to reveal, embarrass, and recalibrate their sense of who I was. I wanted them to feel the shift, to watch complacency crumble under facts they could not spin away. I wanted clarity to replace the comfortable fiction they had been living in. First, I listed what they treasured most: public recognition, social standing, and the illusions they fed each other about success. If I could puncture those illusions in ways that looked like coincidence rather than malice, the humiliation would sting more. I thought about timing, about optics, about the little social currencies they traded in hushed compliments and Instagram stories. I would not shout accusations. I would simply alter the ledger and let the evidence speak. Facts, presented patiently, are harder to argue with than anger. Second, I cataloged their vulnerabilities. My brother was proud of being taken seriously by his circle. His ego was wrapped in a narrative of financial acumen. My sister thrived on being the charismatic center of attention. She curated her image carefully and loathed being upstaged. My parents clung to the idea that they had raised successful children in their image. Each vulnerability suggested a lever I could nudge with minimal fuss and plausible deniability. The plan would be to press those levers in ways that revealed contradictions they could not plausibly explain away. Third, I considered the resources at my disposal. Some overt, some quietly accumulated. Years of professional contacts, the ability to influence reputations with a phone call, access to documents and records broad enough to contradict the little white lies they'd accepted as truth. Money, yes, but more importantly, credibility. I had people who would corroborate facts, people who respected my judgment. That credibility was the hidden capital they never counted when they dismissed me as harmless. I would let others, respected by them, rearrange their assumptions for me. Fourth, I built a timeline. I imagined a sequence that started small, a correction in a public record here, a corrected attribution there, an authoritative voice mentioning a fact they assumed false. Each small correction would be a seed of doubt, proliferating until their carefully tended garden of superiority looked patchy and unkempt. Then, at the right moment, a public demonstration, perhaps at a family event, perhaps through someone they respected, would reveal the pattern and deliver the payoff. I planned for patience. Quick triumphs are messy and obvious. As I stood at the sink, I mentally rehearsed the scripts I might use if confronted. Calm, factual, slightly amused. Never accusatory. Always precise. If my brother insisted he was the sole architect of a deal, I would smile and provide a date and correspondence that quietly told a different story. If my sister attempted to gaslight, I would produce witnesses and receipts in moments she could not refute without looking foolish. The goal was not to destroy them, but to reassign the respect they had hoarded. I thought about my daughter, too. Her role as the distracting catalyst, yes, but more than that, her confidence and wit. She could provoke a reaction, steer conversations, and obfuscate suspicions long enough for me to set delicate pieces in place. I felt an odd surge of tenderness watching her from the mirror. She was becoming the ally I had always wanted in this domestic theater. Her part would be small but pivotal, a well-timed question, a laugh that shifted focus, a seemingly innocent mistake that opened a door at precisely the moment I needed it. My internal monologue settled into a cadence of practicalities. Who to call? Which documents to surface? Which confidants to brief? I envisaged setting modest traps, requests for clarification that would expose inconsistencies, polite corrections to social media posts that would ripple, and gentle acknowledgments from credible third parties that would reframe narratives. Each trap would be surgical, aimed at reputation rather than relationship, at clarity rather than cruelty. I also acknowledged the emotional danger, the risk of becoming the type of person I despised, trading dignity for petty retaliation. I vowed the plan would remain rooted in truth and proportion. This was not revenge for revenge's sake. It was corrective justice, an insistence that reality match perception. I wanted them to know me honestly, not to watch me tear their lives apart. With the plan sketched, I smoothed my dress and returned to the table with the composed smile they expected. Inside, however, my mind ticked with timelines and names. The lunch continued in its asinine rhythm, their jokes and boasts rolling like small waves against a shore I had learned to withstand. They had no idea how methodical the quiet woman across from them could be. The first move was set. The rest would follow. I was quietly, ruthlessly ready now. I started with tiny corrections that looked like courtesy rather than confrontation. At first, it was a comment under my brother's LinkedIn post, an anecdote about the project he claimed as his alone, written calmly and factually, nothing more than a line that referenced a contract date and a mutual colleague who had been involved. It read like a minor addendum, and I watched as his post's comments shifted from congratulatory to curious. Within hours, someone from his network privately messaged me, asking for context, and when I replied with a single, well-placed detail, the curiosity rippled into unease. Next, I let a polite email circulate that clarified the ownership of a family business asset. I framed it as routine housekeeping, updating records, ensuring everyone had the right documents. I sent it through channels that seemed bureaucratic and unthreatening, but the content was precise. My sister forwarded it around with the casual superiority she always wore, and for the first time she stumbled over details when asked for clarification. Her voice, usually smooth and immediate, faltered in a group message thread when someone asked for dates and proof. The hesitation was tiny, but to me it was seismic. I also used people they respected. A former client of mine, someone they had once admired for his blunt praise of my brother, sent a short, professional note, commending my work on a partnership I had quietly led. He mentioned dates, venues, and specific contributions that contradicted the neat little story my brother had been telling. The message was measured, polite, impossible to dismiss as spite. It landed like a small stone thrown into a pond. The ripples were subtle but unmistakable. My brother's supporters began asking questions, and he began offering answers that sounded thinner than before. At a neighborhood gathering a few days later, I arrived with nothing more than my usual calm demeanor and a plate of brownies my daughter had insisted we bring. My brother launched into his familiar monologue about a deal that had made him, expecting adulation. I listened, smiled, and then casually recounted a detail from a meeting that only someone present would know. The room shifted. Conversation stalled. People exchanged looks. My brother's smile tightened, and he excused himself abruptly. I felt the tiny buzz of vindication, like electricity under the skin, satisfying and precise. Moral wins came in quieter forms. I corrected an offhand comment about my work in a community newsletter by offering to volunteer time mentoring young professionals. When the editor publicly thanked me, several young attendees reached out privately, thanking me for the opportunity and sharing stories of how my guidance mattered. Those messages, grateful, earnest, felt like more meaningful currency than any parental praise I'd been denied. Each thank you was a small validation, proof that my contributions had real impact beyond the clipped acknowledgments at family events. My daughter's role was pivotal and beautiful in its simplicity. She interrupted a story at a school event with a casual, confident remark that redirected attention to my accomplishments in a way that felt natural and unforced. Parents who had previously made polite conversation suddenly sought me out to ask about opportunities, to congratulate me without the awkwardness my family's backhanded compliments carried. Watching her, I felt pride that was almost fierce. She was learning to claim space, and in doing so she amplified the quiet corrections I had been making. The initial payoff puzzled them. They squinted at the changing landscape like people trying to read a map rotated slightly. My sister's attempts to recenter the narrative felt thinner, my brother's bravado less convincing. I didn't gloat. I documented, smiled, and let others fill in the blanks. Each small victory was a test of patience and precision. Evidence placed carefully, reputations adjusted gently, dignity preserved where possible. It felt like arranging chess pieces. The board was shifting, and the angles were changing. in ways they hadn't anticipated, knew the next moves had to be bolder, public and undeniable, and already I could see fault lines forming that would make their next mistakes much harder to hide and utterly impossible. By the next week, the subtle shifts I had set in motion began to ripple outward. At first it was nearly imperceptible, a raised eyebrow here, a distracted glance there, but soon it became clear that my family was noticing. My brother, who had always assumed his narratives were untouchable, hesitated mid-sentence during a casual phone call, unsure whether to assert authority or fact-check himself. My sister, usually quick with charm and deflection, faltered when recounting stories to our parents, as if a small but persistent shadow was creeping into her carefully curated image. Even my parents began to glance at me with a flicker of confusion, their smiles no longer automatic, their pride subtly unsettled. I sat quietly during our dinner the next evening, observing each interaction, each slip and hesitation, with a strange sense of satisfaction. Years of being dismissed had honed my attention to detail. I could read every twitch of discomfort, every forced laugh, and every momentary uncertainty. And yet outwardly I remained composed, a calm island in the storm of their confusion. They saw the same face they always had, serene and harmless, completely unaware that the very world they had taken for granted was shifting beneath their feet. I thought back to past betrayals, the casual cruelties disguised as jokes, the favoritism that had shaped my sense of inadequacy, and the countless occasions when their arrogance left them blind to my potential. Each memory fueled a quiet, simmering anticipation for what was coming. Every slight I had endured, every eye roll and whispered insult, had been logged, analyzed, and stored like kindling waiting for the right spark. I realized that my calm exterior was a canvas for a deeper strategy, one that would reveal how profoundly they had underestimated me. Small incidents continued to accumulate. A misremembered detail in a casual conversation exposed my brother's exaggerations. A mistaken assertion about my professional work gave my sister pause in front of relatives. Even my daughter, with her subtle interventions, kept nudging the narrative, redirecting attention in ways that seemed coincidental, but were entirely deliberate. The tension around the table thickened, an invisible weight that grew heavier with each day, and yet I felt no pressure, no urgency. I understood that timing was everything. In those quiet moments of observation, I felt the electric thrill of anticipation. I imagined the climactic moment when all their assumptions, their smug certainties, and their condescension would unravel in ways they could not contain. The slow burn of these days, these subtle adjustments, was preparing them for a reckoning that would be undeniable and unavoidable. And I, finally, was fully in control of the tempo, the timing, and the impact. The evening of the gala arrived, the kind of event my family loved for its glittering appearances and social posturing. My siblings had spent the day practicing smiles and rehearsing anecdotes, expecting admiration for their latest accomplishments. I walked in quietly, letting them settle into their world, my daughter at my side, her presence a small, unspoken promise that the night would not unfold as they assumed. I carried nothing flashy, nothing that screamed wealth or influence, only my confidence and a few subtle tools I had cultivated over years of quiet work. It started innocuously enough, with a simple comment at the hors d'oeuvres table. "I wasn't sure if everyone knew," I said lightly, glancing at my brother. "But the project you presented as your own? It was actually a collaboration I led. I handled the negotiations and secured the contracts." A polite smile, casual tone, as if mentioning the weather. My brother's laugh hitched. Well, you certainly contributed," he stammered, his usual arrogance faltering under the unexpected correction. Guests nearby raised eyebrows, whispering among themselves. My sister tried to recover, launching into a story about her recent social event, but I interrupted gently. "Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that. You may not know that I actually managed the venue and coordinated the sponsorships. It was quite the undertaking." Her carefully cultivated charm stumbled. "Wait, you did what?" she asked, voice sharp with shock. I smiled softly, letting the pause linger just long enough for everyone within earshot to register the implication. Murmurs spread across the room. By now the family's discomfort was palpable. Their practiced confidence, their effortless superiority, began to crumble under the subtle display of my hidden influence. A cousin whispered to my mother, I didn't realize she was behind all of that. My mother's polite expression flickered with confusion, as if trying to reconcile the quiet woman she had dismissed for years with the poised, capable presence now commanding attention. My daughter, sensing the perfect moment, leaned over and said casually, "Mom's just getting started. You didn't think she'd let you show off without a little reality check, did you?" Laughter bubbled from a small cluster of guests nearby, punctuating the shift. The room's energy had changed. My siblings' faces drained of color, their previous amusement replaced with embarrassment and disbelief. Their friends and colleagues, once nodding politely at their stories, now turned to me with genuine curiosity, asking questions and seeking my insight. I let them stew for a moment, enjoying the subtle social shock before adding a final measured detail. "And just to clarify, the new investment venture you were boasting about at lunch? I actually facilitated the introductions and drafted the initial proposals. Everything went through my contacts first." A pause. My brother's mouth opened and closed. My sister fumbled with a napkin. Even my parents looked stricken, their practiced authority evaporating in an instant. The whispers around us intensified, and the room's attention pivoted entirely to me. By the end of the evening, it was undeniable. I had shifted the power dynamic completely. Their assumptions about me, their mockery and dismissals, all lay exposed. The quiet woman at the table, underestimated and overlooked for years, had orchestrated a public display of competence and control that left them speechless. The air was thick with a mix of admiration, surprise, and shame, and I smiled inwardly, savoring the first taste of vindication I had long anticipated. As the evening progressed, it became clear that my daughter's role was far more than symbolic. She moved through the room with quiet confidence, her laughter and casual comments drawing attention without seeming deliberate. When my sister attempted to steer a conversation toward her usual territory of social triumphs, my daughter interjected effortlessly, asking a question that subtly highlighted my contribution to a recent community project. It was small, almost playful, but it forced my sister to stumble over her words, leaving a room full of guests momentarily silent and focused on us. I watched her closely, pride swelling. This wasn't just a child's curiosity. This was a carefully orchestrated distraction that guided attention toward the truths I had quietly built into the evening. She diverted their arrogance just enough for me to reveal key details, but she also did it in a way that made it look spontaneous. Guests leaned in, murmuring and nodding, and my family's smug expressions faltered. For years, they had assumed neither of us could challenge their dominance, but now their underestimation was becoming painfully apparent. Her subtle interventions created openings I exploited with ease. A whispered comment here, a well-timed laugh there. Each small move shifted the energy, putting my siblings off balance and exposing the cracks in their confidence. I felt a quiet thrill at our synchronicity, the way our unspoken understanding allowed us to operate as a team without ever revealing the full extent of our plan. Their reactions were priceless. My brother's forced smile, my sister's narrowed eyes, my parents' hesitant glances. They had no idea we were working in tandem, dismantling their illusions piece by piece. The emotional payoff was immediate. I felt the satisfaction of not only vindicating myself, but also witnessing my daughter step into her own agency, claiming space in a world that had once overlooked her presence. Their recognition, or more accurately their shock, was an unspoken admission of guilt. They had misjudged me, yes, but just as significantly, they had misjudged her. She had learned from observation, absorbed the lessons of strategy and patience, and now she was a partner in the recalibration of authority at the table. By the time the final drinks were served, the air around us had shifted irreversibly. My family's assumptions, their confidence in their superiority, were quietly unspooling. They were forced to confront the reality that the underestimated quiet one and her clever daughter were not only aware, but fully capable of altering the dynamics they had long taken for granted. I felt a warmth, not just of triumph, but of connection, a shared victory with someone I loved deeply, executed with grace, precision, and emotional intelligence. The crescendo arrived during the charity auction, a gathering my family relished for its pomp and prestige. My siblings were mid-story about their supposed contributions, expecting applause and admiration, when I was asked to speak briefly as a guest of honor for a project they had long assumed was insignificant. I stepped to the podium with a composed smile, glancing at my daughter in the front row, who winked subtly. The room's energy shifted instantly. Their smirks faltered as curiosity replaced entitlement. Eyes turned to me, and the familiar hierarchy they had relied on crumbled quietly but completely. I recounted the project in my natural voice, factual and understated, highlighting initiatives they had publicly claimed as their own. Each detail, the negotiations, the partnerships, the outreach, the results, was laid bare, verified by data and testimonials from colleagues who had been present all along. My brother's jaw tightened, his earlier arrogance evaporating as murmurs rippled through the audience. My sister's carefully cultivated charm now seemed forced, her anecdotes rendered irrelevant against the tangible evidence I provided. Guests leaned forward, listening intently, and whispered acknowledgments replaced polite nods. The contrast was striking. Earlier in the week, at lunch, my family had mocked me, dismissed my efforts, and assumed I was powerless. Now, before a room of respected peers, my quiet diligence was celebrated. I had become the undeniable center, their superiority undone by their own assumptions. Each statement I made carried weight. Each pause drew attention to the credibility I had quietly amassed over the years. Where once I was overlooked, now I was recognized, applauded and sought after. The irony was delicious, an invisible satisfaction no one could take away. Even my daughter's role played out beautifully. During a brief Q&A, she asked a pointed question about logistical challenges, drawing attention to the fact that the solutions had been orchestrated under my direction. Laughter and nods of approval spread among the audience, leaving my siblings visibly unsettled. The clever timing of her interjection amplified the contrast between our underestimated past and our commanding present. They had misjudged both of us, and now, in front of everyone, that misjudgment was undeniable. By the time applause erupted, I felt a profound mix of relief and vindication. The years of dismissal, favoritism, and subtle humiliation were replaced with undeniable recognition. My family's arrogance had backfired spectacularly, exposing their overconfidence and poor judgment. They were forced to confront the reality that the quiet, patient, underestimated woman and her insightful, capable daughter had been quietly shaping outcomes all along. The shift was complete, irreversible, and morally satisfying. As I stepped down from the podium, my heart swelled with quiet pride. This was the payoff I had imagined countless times, the balance restored, the truth revealed, and the respect I had earned finally acknowledged publicly. Where once I had been invisible, I now stood fully seen, validated, and victorious. My family left to reconcile the contrast between what they assumed and what had truly been. The gala ended, and we returned home under the soft glow of streetlights, the night carrying a quiet stillness that felt almost sacred. I sank into the living room sofa, my daughter curled beside me, and allowed myself to exhale fully for the first time in years. Relief washed over me, not just for the validation in the eyes of others, but for the knowledge that my patience, strategy, and persistence had been justified. The humiliation I had endured for decades finally found balance in a moment both public and undeniable. I thought about my family, their faces frozen in varying shades of shock, shame, and reluctant admiration. My brother avoided my gaze, his usual bravado diminished. My sister's tight-lipped smiles betrayed a grudging respect, a recognition that the underestimated quiet one had orchestrated a masterstroke they could not deny. Even my parents seemed caught between pride and disbelief, forced to reconcile the image they had of me with the undeniable reality of my capabilities. Sitting there with my daughter, I felt empowerment settle deep in my bones. Years of self-doubt and quiet endurance had been transformed into clarity, strength, and moral closure. I hadn't needed to humiliate anyone unnecessarily, hadn't stooped to cruelty. Instead, I had allowed truth, diligence, and subtle cunning to shine. The contrast between the past, overlooked, mocked, dismissed, and the present, respected, recognized, and validated, was staggering and deeply satisfying. In that quiet aftermath, I realized something else. The victory wasn't just mine. My daughter had learned, absorbed, and contributed, demonstrating intelligence, initiative, and courage that I knew would serve her well throughout her life. Together, we had shifted a narrative long assumed fixed, and in doing so, forged a bond of trust and shared triumph. The emotional closure was complete. The tension dissolved, and the knowledge that justice, quiet, patient, and undeniable, had been served left me with a profound sense of peace. As the evening settled into quiet, I sat by the window watching the city lights flicker, my daughter drawing quietly at the table beside me. The events of the past days played in my mind like a slow-motion montage. Small humiliations, careful planning, the public reveal, and the satisfaction of finally being recognized. I realized that the greatest lesson wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about trusting myself, valuing my own capabilities, and exercising patience in a world that often undervalues the quiet and diligent. The journey had shown me the power of composure, strategy, and subtle influence. Lessons I would carry forward into every aspect of my life. I reflected on the dynamics of my family, now altered irrevocably. Where once they had dismissed, mocked, or assumed control, a new equilibrium had emerged. My siblings were still my family, still flawed and familiar, but the balance of respect had shifted. Their grudging admiration, tinged with shame, reminded me that relationships are never fixed. They are negotiated through actions, consistency, and integrity. I understood that empathy and strategy could coexist, that moral victory need not require cruelty, and that influence gained quietly could be more powerful than loud triumphs. My daughter's presence throughout the ordeal had been a revelation. Watching her contribute, observe, and act with precision filled me with pride and hope. I realized that she had inherited not just my intellect and patience, but also my sense of justice and timing. Our bond, strengthened by shared experience, hinted at a series of future moments where her ingenuity and courage might once again intersect with challenges we had yet to imagine. As I sat quietly, I allowed myself to imagine the possibilities ahead, new challenges, opportunities for growth, and moments of both triumph and learning. The story wasn't over. This chapter had closed, but the narrative continued. Subtle power shifts, unexpected alliances, and the evolution of family dynamics promised more lessons, more strategies, and perhaps more public reckonings. I smiled faintly, aware that life had a rhythm of patience and payoff, and that we, the underestimated ones, were always capable of turning the quiet into unstoppable force.